shall warn you now that this book is not one for the faint-hearted or the prudish. It's a sexy, raunchy tale that explores the depth of humanity in a way some people might not be comfortable with. Today I'm talking about Story of the Eye by Georges Bataille. Now, I've spoken about this author before. I have another of his books called Literature and Evil, which I have not yet read, but I was interested in getting to this one when seeing it in Waterstones. So it's difficult to explain the story of this one, but I will explain the book. Within this book, you have the story of the eye, and then after the story, you have a little reflection called Coincidences, in which Bataille discusses his own experiences and how they shaped the story that he had written. Then, after that, we get the preface. It was interesting to see the preface after the text itself, but I think it worked that way. Then this is when we leave Bataille and we read two essays, one by Susan Sontag and the other by Roland Barthes. Now, not only was Bataille an author that I really wanted to get to, but seeing that they had essays from Sontag and Barthes really made me want to pick this book up straight away. However, like I said at the start, this is not one for the faint-hearted. This is an exploration of sex, of sadism, of utter base desire, and the implications that come from such deep wanting and deep passion. It's a work of pornography, a work of erotica, a work of disturbing darkness. On the one hand, it's a sensuous story that provokes pleasure within you in a way that you perhaps didn't want to. But on the other hand, it is a narcotic nightmare that has you wondering how far can the characters truly go. What I enjoyed about this story was that there wasn't really a plot. The entire story was driven by sex and the characters' desire for more sex and pushing the boundaries of what sex can really mean. And yet somehow, despite reading sexual acts over and over again in a way that kind of rubs you raw and as if you are living an excessive act of sex itself, you kind of are hooked and you cannot get out of the story and you cannot escape where these characters are going, even if you truly want to. The acts that these characters get up to drive the plot forwards, and it moves them to different places, different times, and in touch with different characters in a way that connects lots of people together and connects you, the reader, with something so despicable and yet devilishly delightful. To experience Europe, or at least a small part of Europe, through sex and through these characters, you get a real taste of how Christianity has truly shaped our European nationhood and European mindset, and ultimately the steadfastness in the way that we live and choose not to live. It gets really graphic very early on, and it gets really dark quite quickly. Now, one of the biggest reasons I was interested in this book is because, of course, I have a real interest in the Surrealist movement. Now, Bataille himself, to say that he was a part of the Surrealist movement could be a lie. He was almost on the fringes of the Surrealist movement. He moved in and out of the circles that the Surrealists were also moving in, and he definitely was a part of that movement. However, he sort of defected from it quite early on, and he didn't truly believe in their mindset and what they wanted to do. However, you can see in this text itself that there are elements of Surrealism in here. Surrealism is about discomforting reality and creating sort of binary disjunctions that get you to think about something you might not have thought about before. And in this book, there are images and symbols that are constantly in flux with each other, and provide you with a sense of dreamlike, manic pleasure yet fear. And it's reflected most clearly in the way that sex is linked yet juxtaposed to death. There are constant images of death and then sex, and they kind of go hand in hand. They work together and they fight against each other, and it makes you wonder, to where is the obsession? Is it an obsession with sex, or is it an obsession with death? And therefore, how can we reflect on how we deal with sex and pleasure versus how we deal with death and fear? And where are the boundaries in those, and how can we clearly define such different areas, when it can be argued, as it is in this text and the essays afterwards, that they can actually go hand in hand. I remember that one day, when we were in a car tooling along at top speed, we crashed into a cyclist, an apparently very young and very pretty girl. Her head was almost totally ripped off by the wheels. For a long time we were parked a few yards beyond without getting out, fully absorbed in the sight of the corpse. The horror and despair at so much bloody flesh, nauseating in part, and in part very beautiful, was fairly equivalent to our usual impression upon seeing each other. There's also the image of the eye, hence the name of the story, and it's very reminiscent of the short film that Salvador Dali created. And I just had that image of a razor cutting open the eye at certain parts of this text, so you can see how this inspiration affected lots of different people within this specific time and this specific movement. Of course, the eye then goes on to mean so much more in this text, yet it still does have that surrealist essence of making you question the reality that you have grown comfortable with. I think this is also a very interesting text if you are interested in gender and gender studies and reflecting on whether or not this is a feminist text. Surrealism is quite renowned for not particularly being the strongest of feminist movements. They tend to sort of utilize women in a way of purity and chastity and the ideal feminine position, and therefore they cannot do anything without the man's help. However, this book kind of destroys any concept of gender. Gender doesn't seem to exist, but sex absolutely does. And the genitalia of the characters play a very important role, as you would guess. However, of course, genitalia doesn't represent gender. And so the roles that the characters take on are very fluid and almost insidious in its way of breaking boundaries. The two main characters are a man and a woman, yet at no point do they ever take on roles that would denote their gender. They are both equally as terrible, they are both equally as free, they are both equally as able to get what they want when they want. They have the same level of agency and they have the same level of disrespect for others. There are obviously scenes of rape within this text, yet there are also boundaries which question the level of consent given, and it really makes you think about all the other characters' positions in this and how much consent do they give to be a part of the story, and what does it mean when their consent to be a part of the story is taken away from them from the author and then used and abused by the characters within. And the imagery itself destroys the concept of gender. We have images of the sun and the moon. We have images of the egg and the eye, and they're constantly working with and against each other in a strange cycle that kind of defies gender. On the one hand, the egg, which is so famously known as representative of fertility and the woman and womanhood, yet in this book, whilst it has that meaning, it also represents semen and the man's seed and his testicles and the sort of testosterone-filled desire to penetrate. Then we have the moon and the sun, two figures that are normally deemed feminine and masculine, and yet in this book they're neither. They are both forces that represent the masculine and the feminine. They represent the egg, they represent the semen, but then they also go on to represent the urine and the urethra and the release of piss in a way that then becomes blurred with the release of cum. Throughout this text there are so many different bodily fluids that are moving around as strongly as any other character in the story, and it then makes you call into question your own understandings of dirt, dirtiness, disgust, and where does the boundaries lie between disgust and pleasure, particularly in sex. I think this book was edited masterfully. To put the story first, and then to put the reflection, which is how it was originally published anyway, allows you the space to form your own opinion and to then create a sense of the author. And the reflection afterwards then kind of suggests to you another perspective. However, if they had done it the other way around, with the reflection first from the author, which a lot of text would do, and then the story, it would have coloured it in a way that would have completely ruined your own enjoyment and pleasure of this. Bataille writes in his reflections, "I was very astonished at having unknowingly substituted a perfectly obscene image for a vision apparently devoid of any sexual implication. Still, I would soon have cause for even greater astonishment," which is really interesting to think about how surrealism isn't really an unreality, but it's just another wavelength of reality. Then to have the preface after those two, I felt was a good decision, because again, it allowed you to form your own opinion, and then to read the preface just gave you that extra layer that you may or may not have needed, however you wouldn't have got had the preface come first. And then the outline of the sequel that comes after it was very interesting to see where Bataille kind of imagined the story going. However, I personally feel that that could have been left out, but I understand why it was left in, and it did give you an extra... and it did give you a different understanding of the text. And then the essays themselves were wonderful. Sontag really questions the role of art and pornography, and she casts doubt about the way that we sort of define literature and the way that we create binaries of good and bad literature, and how pornography fits into these positions. On the one hand, you get erotica that's just cast aside as not being worthy, but then on the other hand you get a text like this, which is no different really, yet is classed as a piece of art, and Sontag, constantly attacks this notion and questions the way that society has designed pornography and the way that society has designed literature, and how pornography then fits into literature. And then Barthes goes on to explain the symbolism throughout the text, which is interesting because that is what Barthes does well, and I enjoyed that part, and it was nice to know that, and I think it was a true sign of Bataille's writing talent for me to have completely agreed with what Barthes said and to completely have noticed it within text. So it was kind of just like that little nudge where somebody's just been like, yeah, you're on the right track. So the way that it was edited and the way that you read through the entire book was really smooth. Each part constantly added on to the part before without taking any worth from any other part. And I really appreciated that, because you often don't get such a well-edited book in that respect, particularly in regards to Death in Spring with Colm Toibin's preface. If you're interested in erotica and the role of sex in art, this book is definitely one for you. If you're interested in the boundaries between reality and dreamscapes and desire and pleasure within those, again, this is one for you. It's definitely not going to be up to everyone's taste. It is quite crude. However, I think it is worth to kind of then reflect on why you think it's crude and why you think you might not enjoy it, because then you kind of question your role in society and the way that societal structures have kind of defined sex, and how perhaps we shouldn't be so controlled by what is right and what is wrong. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book. And yet, what an atrocity. It seemed as if nothing could terminate the tragi-comical frenzy of these lunatics. For Marcel, still naked, kept gesticulating, and her agonizing streaks of pain expressed unbearable terror and moral suffering. We watched her bite her mother's face amid arms vainly trying to subdue her.